Good evening, and welcome to History, to fall asleep. Tonight, we are wandering into the Renaissance, not as a rushed tour through famous paintings or a test of dates, but as a slow walk through streets of stone, rooms lit by candles, workshops dusted with pigment, libraries filled with fragile books, and cities where people were learning to look at the world in new ways. The Renaissance is often described as a rebirth. It was a time when many Europeans became deeply interested in classical learning, human possibility, art, architecture, science, music, trade, and the complicated drama of city life. Yet it was never one simple moment, and it was never the same for everyone. It had beauty, invention, rivalry, inequality, faith, violence, and a great deal of quiet work. Tonight, we will explore 100 relaxing facts about this remarkable period. We will meet painters and printers, merchants and musicians, architects and map makers. We will move through Florence and Venice, Rome, and the wider world beyond Italy. We will look at domes, manuscripts, garden paths, busy markets, and the small practical skills behind the grandest achievements. There is nothing you need to remember. You do not need to keep track of every century or every name. Let the facts arrive gently and pass through your thoughts at their own pace. If these calm historical journeys help you settle into the evening, you are welcome to subscribe to History to fall asleep. But for now, let your shoulders loosen, let your breathing become easy, and let the modern world recede a little. We begin in a Europe of rivers and roads, ships and bells, crowded cities and distant horizons. A world where an old book, a line of perspective, or a new way of mixing paint could change how people imagined everything around them. Let us begin. Fact 1. The Renaissance was not one single event. The Renaissance was not a door that opened on one morning. It was a long, uneven period of change in art, learning, trade, and politics, usually associated with parts of Europe between the 14th and 16th centuries. Different cities experienced it at different tempos. Florence, Venice, Rome, Naples, Antwerp, Nuremberg, and many other places each had their own rhythm. Some older medieval habits continued quietly beside new ambitions. That is why the Renaissance is best imagined, not as a sudden awakening, but as a slow turning of attention. People looked again at old books, old buildings, old questions, and then made something new from them. Let that small part of the story settle for a moment. The Renaissance was built from layers, not sudden flashes. One workshop, one letter, one copied page, one conversation, and one careful decision at a time. Fact 2. Its name means rebirth, but history did not begin again. The word Renaissance comes from the French word for rebirth. Writers of the period admired ancient Greece and Rome, and sometimes described centuries between antiquity and their own day as a decline. Modern historians are more careful. Medieval Europe had universities, cathedrals, libraries, artists, engineers, and long traditions of scholarship. The Renaissance did not erase that world. It borrowed from it, argued with it, and changed some of its priorities. The name remains useful because it describes a real surge of interest in classical texts, natural observation, artistic experiment, and human learning. But it should never make the earlier centuries seem empty or asleep. There is no need to hold every detail in your mind. You can simply picture a lamplit room, a sheet of paper, and someone pausing over a problem that another generation may one day call important. Fact 3. Italy became a cluster of powerful city-states. Much of the early Italian Renaissance grew among city-states rather than a single unified country. Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, Siena, Naples, and the Papal States each had governments, rivalries, markets, armies, and distinct local identities. A traveler could cross a short distance and find a different ruler, dialect, currency, or political custom. This close competition mattered. Cities wanted impressive churches, public squares, libraries, paintings, and defenses. They wanted visitors to see wealth and confidence. Art was beautiful, but it was also a public statement. A dome on the skyline or a new statue in a square could quietly say that a city believed it belonged among the great places of the world. For now, let the scene become quiet. Beyond the famous names were ordinary streets, shutters closing at dusk, footsteps on stone, and the patient work that allowed larger dreams to take shape. Fact 4. Florence became a famous center of Renaissance culture. Florence was not the only Renaissance city, but it became one of its most famous symbols. Built along the Arno River in Tuscany, it was a place of textile production, banking, guilds, commerce, and civic argument. Its streets were filled with workshops where cloth was dyed, metal was shaped, leather was worked, books were copied, and paintings were prepared. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Florence became a major center of humanist scholarship and artistic production. Its wealth did not make life easy for everyone, and its politics could be fierce. Yet the concentration of skilled makers, ambitious patrons, and educated readers created unusually fertile ground for new ideas. The past can feel far away until we notice its familiar rhythms. Learning a skill, waiting for a reply, saving for a purchase, making something carefully, and hoping it will last. Fact 5. Guilds shaped work and civic life. Guilds were associations that organized many trades in Renaissance cities. A guild could regulate training, standards, membership, and parts of public life. In Florence, major guilds were connected to powerful occupations, such as wool, silk, banking, and law. Lesser guilds represented other crafts and services. A young person often learned a trade through apprenticeship, beginning with simple tasks and gradually earning trust. Guilds also supported religious ceremonies, charitable work, and civic display. Their banners appeared in public processions. Their money could help pay for buildings and artworks. When we look at a Renaissance city, we should remember that behind the great names were many organized communities of workers, each carrying skills from one generation to the next. Picture the evening arriving over tiled roofs. Bells soften in the distance. Workshop doors close, and the day's unfinished questions remain on a table for tomorrow's hands to answer. Fact 6. Banks helped move money across long distances. Renaissance banking did not look like a modern bank, with plastic cards and digital screens. It depended on written records, trusted agents, letters, bills of exchange, and complicated networks of family and partnership. Merchants needed ways to pay for goods in distant ports without carrying large amounts of coin through the dangerous roads. Bankers helped make that possible. Florence became especially known for financial activity, and the Medici family became one of its most influential banking families. Money, credit, and information moved together. A letter might contain news of a ship, a price, a political rumor, and instructions for a payment. In a world without instant communication, careful writing was one of the quiet engines of commerce. A great age is never made only by its most famous people. It also depends on quiet, concentration, a pigment ground smooth, a page corrected, a measurement checked, or a parcel carried safely home. Fact 7. The Medici were patrons as well as bankers. The Medici are often remembered as if they were a single, all-powerful family. But their influence changed over generations and was never without challenge. Their wealth and political standing allowed members of the family to support churches, artists, scholars, buildings, festivals, and collections of ancient objects. Patronage was not simply generosity. It could express faith, civic pride, family honor, political strategy, and personal taste at the same time. A chapel, library, sculpture, or painting could preserve a donor's name long after a ledger was forgotten. The Medici were one prominent example of a wider Renaissance pattern. Ambitious families and institutions using art and learning to shape how their world remembered them. As the story moves on, allow the details to drift like warm light across a wall. Some will remain clear. Others can fade gently, leaving only the calm feeling of a world slowly changing. Fact 8. Patronage paid for much of Renaissance art. Most Renaissance artists did not create masterpieces in complete isolation and then hope someone would notice them. They worked through commissions. A church, confraternity, city office, merchant, court, monastery, or wealthy family might request an altar painting, a portrait, a tomb, a palace decoration, a banner, or a sculpture. Contracts could specify materials, deadlines, dimensions, pigments, and even the amount of gold to be used. Patrons often expected a work to serve a purpose, whether devotion, prestige, remembrance, or celebration. This does not make the art less imaginative. It shows how imagination met real conditions: money, workshops, stone, wood, weather, family expectations, and the wishes of people who would stand before the finished work or condom. It is enough to notice the patience inside the achievement. Behind every finished object was a long sequence of small movements, repeated until a difficult task became familiar to the hands. Fact 9. Humanism centered on the study of human affairs. Renaissance humanism was not identical to the modern idea of being non-religious. It was an educational movement that emphasized the study of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, especially through classical Greek and Roman texts. Humanists believed that language and literature could help shape judgment, character, and public life. They read ancient authors closely, compared manuscripts, corrected errors, and wrote elegant Latin, while many also valued vernacular languages. Religious belief remained central for many humanists. Their interest was not necessarily to reject faith, but to explore human capacity, civic responsibility, eloquence, memory, and the moral choices people make in the world. The Renaissance can seem crowded with remarkable events, yet daily life still moved at a human pace. Meals, errands, weather, prayer, repairs, letters, and the quiet return of night. Fact 10. Classical antiquity became a source of questions. Renaissance scholars and artists often turned toward ancient Greece and Rome for models, stories, languages, architecture, and ideas. They admired old statues, coins, inscriptions, ruins, and manuscripts. Yet they were not simply copying the past. Ancient material gave them a standard to study, and sometimes to surpass. A Roman arch could suggest a new kind of building. A Latin speech could inspire a different style of writing. A broken marble torso could invite an artist to think about movement and anatomy. The past seemed both distant and alive. It was a storehouse of examples, but it also raised difficult questions about virtue, power, citizenship, beauty, and the fragile survival of knowledge. Let your thoughts travel slowly through the scene. Nothing here needs to be hurried. Each fact is only another doorway into a world that was complex, beautiful, difficult, and deeply human. Fact 11. Petrarch became an early symbol of humanist curiosity. Francesco Petrarca, often called Petrarch, lived in the 14th century and became a lasting symbol of early humanist learning. He wrote poetry in Italian, but he also searched for and studied Latin manuscripts. His letters and reflections expressed a powerful sense that old texts could speak across centuries. Petrarch's fame later encouraged the idea that the Renaissance was a revival of classical learning. Like all historical labels, that story is simpler than reality. Still, his life captures something important. A scholar could feel excitement, not only at discovering information, but at meeting another mind through a fragile text copied long ago by an unknown hand. There is a peaceful lesson in this. Knowledge often grows through attention rather than noise, through people noticing a detail that others had passed without seeing. Fact 12. Manuscripts traveled before printing, made books common. Before printed books spread across Europe, every manuscript had to be written by hand. That took time, skilled labor, parchment or paper, ink and patience. A book might be copied in a monastery, a university town, a court, or a professional workshop. Errors could enter at every stage, and readers often added notes in margins or between lines. Humanist scholars compared versions of texts in an effort to get closer to what an ancient author had written. The work could be painstaking. A single misplaced word might change a sentence. Yet, that slow attention also created communities of readers who treated books not as ordinary objects, but as companions carried across time. Imagine a window open to the evening air. Somewhere below, a cart rolls over stone, a dog barks once, a candle is lit, and another person begins the careful work of reading or making. Fact 13. Greek learning reached Italy through many routes. The Renaissance did not receive ancient Greek knowledge from one dramatic moment or one single group of travelers. Greek texts, teachers, manuscripts and traditions had moved through long networks linking the Byzantine world, Italy, Islamic centers of learning, and other parts of the Mediterranean, the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was important to many later stories of the Renaissance, but Greek learning had already been entering Italy for generations. Translation, trade, diplomacy, travel, and migration all played their part. This wider setting matters because Renaissance Europe was never sealed off. Its intellectual life grew through contact, borrowing, disagreement, and the patient movement of ideas between languages and shores. The important thing is not to memorize every name. It is to feel the long current beneath them. People sharing skills, preserving ideas, and trying to make sense of the world around them. Fact: the 14 Japanicians used both Latin and local languages. Latin remained the learned language of universities, diplomacy, law, and much scholarship. But Renaissance writers also made bold use of Italian, French, English, Spanish, Dutch, German, and other vernacular languages. Dante, Boccaccio, and later writers showed that local speech could carry serious poetry, philosophy, comedy, history, and emotion. The choice of language affected who could read a work and how it would travel. A polished Latin treatise might speak to scholars across Europe. A poem in Italian might reach readers in a city or region more directly. The Renaissance did not abandon Latin. It became a period in which several languages lived together, each carrying its own authority and audience. Let the picture remain soft around the edges. The Renaissance was full of sharp ambitions, but it was also filled with calm moments of study, craft, music, conversation, and observation. Fact 15. Paper made sketching and writing more flexible. Paper had been known in Europe before the Renaissance, but its growing availability changed everyday intellectual and artistic work. Compared with parchment, paper could be less costly and easier to use for drafts, letters, account books, designs, and quick observations. Artists increasingly used it to test ideas before committing them to a wall, panel, or block of marble. A drawing could record the fold of cloth, the turn of a shoulder, the plan of a building, or the movement of water. It could be revised, carried, folded, copied, or tucked into a notebook. Paper made thought more visible. It allowed private experiments that might later become public art. Now the scene can rest for a breath. A city, like a painting, is made from many layers, some bright and visible, others almost hidden beneath the surface. Fact 16. Workshops trained artists over many years. The Renaissance artist workshop was a busy place. Apprentices learnt it by preparing panels, grinding pigments, stretching canvas, copying drawings, cleaning tools, mixing plaster, and observing older hands at work. A master might design a major composition, while assistants handled background, details, repeated patterns, or sections of a large commission. Training was practical and social. Young artists learned not only how to draw, but how to negotiate with clients, buy materials, keep a reputation, and manage time. The romantic image of a lone genius can hide this reality. Many celebrated works were made in environments full of shared labor, conversation, mistakes, corrections, and the ordinary sounds of craft. Think of how slowly materials become meaningful. Stone becomes a statue, ink becomes a book, cloth becomes a banner, and a shared idea becomes something that can outlast its first speaker. Fact 17. Drawing became a way of thinking. In the Renaissance, drawing was more than a preliminary step. It became a way to investigate ideas. Artists used pen, ink, chalk, charcoal, metal point, and washes to explore possible forms before a final work existed. They drew hands, drapery, buildings, plants, animals, machines, and faces. A page might contain several unrelated studies, because the artist was following curiosity wherever it led. The Italian word disegno could refer to drawing, design, and the intellectual conception behind a work. This made a sketch feel almost like a visible thought. The hand moved over paper, while the mind tested possibilities. Sometimes the most intimate evidence of artist's imagination is not a finished painting, but a restless sheet of experiments. The centuries do not need to feel distant tonight. A hand turning a page, a maker checking a line, or a family gathering around a table are scenes that remain understandable across time. Fact 18. Linear perspective organized space on a flat surface. Linear perspective was one of the most famous Renaissance tools for creating the appearance of deep space in a painting. By arranging lines so that they seemed to meet at a vanishing point, artists could suggest roads, rooms, tiled floors, and buildings extending away from the viewer. It was not the first attempt in history to show depth, and it did not replace every other artistic method. But in 15th century Italy, perspective became a powerful and carefully studied system. It joined observation with geometry. A painted room could seem to open behind a wall. A street could lead the eye toward a far horizon. The result was not only technical. It changed how viewers felt inside a picture. Let the noise of the day grow quieter as we continue. The history of the Renaissance is not only about display. It is also about waiting, observing, revising, and beginning again. Fact 19. Alberti wrote about art and architecture. Leon Battista Alberti was one of the Renaissance figures who moved easily between several fields. He wrote about painting, architecture, family life, and other subjects, and he helped give artistic ideas a theoretical language. In his writings, painting could be understood through geometry, proportion, composition, and the careful arrangement of figures. Architecture could draw inspiration from ancient buildings while responding to modern needs. Alberti's importance lies partly in this habit of connecting practice with thought. He treated the artist and architect not simply as a skilled worker, but as someone whose knowledge involved observation, learning, and reason. That idea helped raise the cultural status of the arts. In the background of every grand story are ordinary sounds. Water being poured, tools being set down, paper rustling, footsteps crossing a room, and a door closing against the night. Fact 20. Brunelleschi's dome transformed Florence's skyline. The dome of Florence Cathedral remains one of the most memorable achievements of Renaissance architecture. The cathedral had stood unfinished for years because covering its enormous crossing seemed technically difficult. Brunelleschi developed an ambitious solution using a double shell structure and ingenious building methods. The project took decades and demanded coordination among workers, materials, machines, and civic authorities. From the streets below, the dome was more than a roof. It became a symbol of Florence itself. Visible from far beyond the city, bold in scale and inseparable from civic pride. It also shows that Renaissance brilliance often depended on practical knowledge. Not only graceful ideas, stone, brick, gravity, pulleys, scaffolds, and disciplined labor all had to cooperate. The further we go, the more the Renaissance becomes a living landscape rather than a list of dates. It contains people with hopes, limits, rivalries, routines, and brief moments of wonder. Fact 21. Architecture borrowed classical forms in new ways. Renaissance architects studied columns, arches, domes, pediments, and proportions associated with ancient Roman and Greek buildings. They did not simply reproduce ruins. They rearranged classical vocabulary for churches, palaces, libraries, courtyards, and villas. A column might guide the eye through a courtyard. A round arch might create a calm rhythm across a facade. A dome might signal sacred space and civic prestige at once. The appeal of classical forms was partly visual, but it was also intellectual. They suggested order, balance, and a connection with admired antiquity. In Renaissance buildings, architecture became a conversation between old examples, new materials, urban needs, and the desire to make reason visible in stone. Let that small part of the story settle for a moment. The Renaissance was built from layers, not sudden flashes. One workshop, one letter, one copied page, one conversation, and one careful decision at a time. Fact 22. Churches remained central to Renaissance life. The Renaissance did not replace religion with art or learning. Churches, monasteries, confraternities, pilgrimage sites, and religious orders remained deeply woven into daily life. Many of the greatest Renaissance commissions were made for sacred settings. Altarpieces, fresco cycles, chapels, tombs, reliquaries, choir books, and architecture. Artists brought new attention to bodies, landscapes, space, and emotion. but often within biblical stories and devotional practices. A painted virgin, a crucifixion, or a saint's life could be both intensely spiritual and carefully observed. The Renaissance is therefore not best understood as a simple move away from faith. It was a period in which religious experience, civic identity, family ambition, and artistic innovation often met in the same room. There is no need to hold every detail in your mind. You can simply picture a lamplit room, a sheet of paper, and someone pausing over a problem that another generation may one day call important. Fact 23. Fresco painting joined color to wet plaster. Fresco painting required speed, planning, and confidence. In the technique called buon fresco, artists applied pigment to fresh, wet plaster. As the plaster dried, the color became part of the wall's surface. Because the plaster could not remain workable forever, painters divided a large design into daily sections, often called goodnight. A skilled observer can sometimes see the edges of these sections in a finished mural. Fresco demanded careful preparation. Cartoons, measurements, scaffolding, plaster mixing, and assistance. It also required the artist to think ahead. A mistake in wet plaster was difficult to hide. The quiet beauty of a fresco can make it appear effortless, but it is the visible result of a schedule governed by moisture, lime, daylight, and human concentration. For now, let the scene become quiet. Beyond the famous names were ordinary streets, shutters closing at dusk, footsteps on stone, and the patient work that allowed larger dreams to take shape. Fact 24. Oil paint encouraged slow layers of light. Oil paint gave Renaissance artists new ways to make surfaces appear deep, soft, and alive. Because it dries slowly, an artist can adjust edges, blend tones, and build a scene through thin, translucent layers. Light seems to pass through those layers and return from within the color. In Northern Europe, painters used oil to achieve astonishing detail in cloth, metal, glass, skin, and reflected light. Italian painters adapted and developed the medium in their own ways. Oil did not remove the need for drawing or composition. It expanded the range of effects available to an artist. A shadow could become smoky rather than sharp. A face could seem to breathe. A distant landscape could fade almost imperceptibly into blue air. The past can feel far away until we notice its familiar rhythms. Learning a skill, waiting for a reply, saving for a purchase, making something carefully, and hoping it will last. Fact 25. Donatello gave sculpture new presence. Donatello was one of the great sculptors of the early Renaissance. His works explored movement, expression, age, youth, strength, vulnerability, and the physical presence of the human body. He worked in marble, bronze, wood, and relief, showing how different materials could carry different emotions. His famous bronze David is often discussed as a revival of freestanding nude sculpture in a scale not seen in Western Europe for many centuries. Yet Donatello's importance is wider than one work. He helped make sculpture feel alert and psychologically alive. A figure could lean, turn, pause, or seem to think. In his hands, A block of stone or a cast of bronze could feel almost like a person caught between one breath and the next. Picture the evening arriving over tiled roofs. Bells soften in the distance, workshop doors close, and the day's unfinished questions remain on a table for tomorrow's hands to answer. Fact 26. David became a flexible Renaissance symbol. The biblical figure of David held special meaning for Renaissance Florence. He was young, unexpected, and victorious against a stronger opponent. That made him a useful symbol for a city that often imagined itself as small but determined amid larger powers. Artists depicted David in different moods: triumphant, watchful, thoughtful, or almost vulnerable. Donatello and Michelangelo both made famous sculptures of him, but their versions feel very different. One seems to look back after victory. The other appears tense before action. This variety shows how Renaissance artists returned to familiar stories without repeating them mechanically. The same subject could become a new meditation on courage, beauty, civic identity, and the fragile balance between confidence and danger. A great age is never made only by its most famous people. It also depends on quiet concentration. A pigment ground smooth, a page corrected, a measurement checked, or a parcel carried safely home. Fact 27. Michelangelo treated the human body as expressive form. Michelangelo Buonarroti worked as a sculptor, painter, draftsman, poet, and architect. His art gave the human body extraordinary force. Muscles, torsion, weight, and gesture became a language of feeling. A figure might twist under pressure, gather itself for movement, or sit in an attitude of grief. Michelangelo studied the body intensely, but he was not simply copying anatomy. He used form to make emotion visible. His marble sculptures often seem to hold energy inside the stone, as if movement has been paused at its most powerful instant. Later viewers called him a genius, but his achievement also came from long training. Hard labor, repeated drawing, and a willingness to wrestle with materials that could not be easily forgiven. As the story moves on, allow the details to drift like warm light across a wall. Some will remain clear. Others can fade gently, leaving only the calm feeling of a world slowly changing. Fact 28. The Sistine Chapel ceiling was a vast, coordinated project. Michelangelo's ceiling for the Sistine Chapel in Rome is often treated as the work of a single miraculous moment. In reality, it was a large and demanding project, painted over several years on scaffolding high above the chapel floor. The ceiling combines biblical scenes, prophets, sibyls, ancestors, architectural illusion, and a multitude of figures. It required planning on a monumental scale. The artist had to adapt designs to curved surfaces, changing light, the physical strain of painting overhead, and the pressure of a papal mission, and the pressure of a papal commission. What visitors now see in a few minutes was created through countless hours of drawing, plastering, mixing, climbing, and correcting. Grandeur was built from routine. It is enough to notice the patience inside the achievement. Behind every finished object was a long sequence of small movements, repeated until a difficult task became familiar to the hands. Fact 29. Leonardo used drawing to investigate the world. Leonardo da Vinci was trained in Florence and worked in several Italian cities before spending his final years in France. He is famous as a painter, but his notebooks reveal a mind constantly observing motion, water, birds, machines, anatomy, plants, and light. Drawing was his main tool for investigation. He filled pages with questions, diagrams, reversed handwriting, and visual experiments. Some of his projects remained unfinished, and many of his discoveries were not published in his lifetime. That makes his notebooks especially intimate. They are not polished lectures delivered after certainty. They are records of a person looking, wondering, comparing, and trying again. His greatest habit may have been attention itself. The Renaissance can seem crowded with remarkable events, yet daily life still moved at a human pace. Meals, errands, weather, prayer, repairs, letters, and the quiet return of night. Fact 30. The Mona Lisa was once a private portrait. The Mona Lisa is among the world's most familiar paintings, but it began as a much more intimate object. It is generally identified as a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, the wife of Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo. The painting became famous over centuries through its craftsmanship, later reputation, and the strange calm of Sita's expression. Its pose and three-quarter view helped create a sense of connection between viewer and subject. Yet, the painting also demonstrates the Renaissance portrait's larger purpose. A portrait could preserve memory, announce status, mark a marriage, or offer an image of cultivated identity. Behind every celebrated face was a social world of households, clothing, property, expectation, and private history. Let your thoughts travel slowly through the scene. Nothing here needs to be hurried. Each fact is only another doorway into a world that was complex, beautiful, difficult, and deeply human. Fact 31. Renaissance portraiture made individuals more visible. Portraits became increasingly important in Renaissance Europe, especially among rulers, merchants, scholars, nobles, and families who wished to preserve a likeness. Painters explored how clothing, hands, books, jewelry, interiors, animals, and distant views could suggest a sitter's status or character. A portrait did not necessarily show a person exactly as a camera would. It was carefully constructed. The sitter might appear wiser, calmer, wealthier, more devout, or more connected to learning than everyday life allowed. Still, Renaissance portraits often give an unusually strong sense of individual presence. A face looks outward. A hand rests on a book. A window opens onto a landscape. The person seems to occupy a particular moment, even after centuries have passed. There is a peaceful lesson in this. Knowledge often grows through attention rather than noise, through people noticing a detail that others had passed without seeing. Fact 32. Botticelli painted mythological stories for elite viewers. Sandro Botticelli created religious paintings, portraits, and works inspired by classical mythology. His famous images of Venus and springtime are often seen as symbols of Renaissance beauty. They were not everyday decorations for ordinary homes. Such works belonged to cultured and wealthy environments, where viewers could discuss poetry, ancient stories, marriage, moral ideas, and visual grace. Botticelli's figures often seem to move through a world of delicate line, flowing hair, pale light, and patterned plants. Their beauty is not simply naturalistic, it is poetic. The paintings show that Renaissance interest in antiquity could take many forms: scholarly, political, religious, playful, philosophical, and deeply tied to the private tastes of patrons. Imagine a window open to the evening air. Somewhere below, a cart rolls over stone, a dog barks once, a candle is lit, and another person begins the careful work of reading or making. Fact 33. Venice gave the Renaissance a different atmosphere. Venice was a maritime republic built across islands and waterways, connected to long-distance trade in the Mediterranean and beyond. Its Renaissance culture had a different character from Florence's. Water reflected light across walls and canals. Trade brought pigments, textiles, spices, objects, and ideas through the city. Venetian painters became famous for rich color, luminous atmosphere, and the ability to make a scene feel filled with air. Venice was also a major center of printing, publishing, diplomacy, and luxury craft. Its power rested partly on ships and commerce, but its culture also rested on a constant awareness of movement. Boats arriving, bells crossing water, light changing, and distant lands entering the city's imagination. The important thing is not to memorize every name. It is to feel the long current beneath them, people sharing skills, preserving ideas, and trying to make sense of the world around them. Fact 34. Titian became a master of Venetian painting. Titian was one of the leading painters of 16th century Venice. His works include religious images, mythological scenes, and portraits of rulers, nobles, and powerful patrons. He became known for color that seems to breathe, and for brushwork that could be both controlled and free. In portraits, he could make fabric, armor, skin, and personality appear together. In mythological scenes, he combined classical stories with rich landscapes and sensual color. Titian's long career also shows the changing status of the artist. He worked for major patrons across Europe and maintained a reputation that traveled far beyond Venice. His paintings remind us that a Renaissance workshop could be local in its materials, yet international in its influence. Let the picture remain soft around the edges. The Renaissance was full of sharp ambitions, but it was also filled with calm moments of study, craft, music, conversation, and observation. Fact 35. Renaissance art developed in Northern Europe too. The Renaissance was not limited to Italy. In the Low Countries, Germany, France, England, Spain, and other regions, artists and scholars developed their own versions of classical learning, natural observation, print culture, and religious debate. Northern painters often became celebrated for detailed surfaces: fur, glass, metal, wood, fabric, flowers, and reflected light. Northern humanists, such as Erasmus, used newsprint network readers across Europe. Italian artists and northern artists influenced one another through travel, trade prints, books, diplomatic gifts, and patrons. It is better to imagine several Renaissances rather than one. They shared some questions, but they answered them in different climates, languages, institutions, and artistic traditions. Now the scene can rest for a breath. A city, like a painting, is made from many layers, some bright and visible, others almost hidden beneath the surface. Fact 36. Jan van Eyck made oil paint seem almost miraculous. Jan van Eyck worked in the Burgundian Netherlands during the 15th century and is often associated with the astonishing possibilities of oil painting. He did not invent oil paint, but he used it with extraordinary skill. His pictures can make glass shine, jewels glint, velvet absorb light, and distant rooms seem carefully measured. The detail invites slow looking. Yet the paintings are not only displays of technique, they are filled with symbols, social meanings, religious thought, and carefully arranged space. Van Eyck's work shows why the Renaissance should not be described only through Italian sculpture and domes. Northern Europe offered a different but equally powerful vision of what close observation could achieve. Wesson, think of how slowly materials become meaningful. Stone becomes a statue. Ink becomes a book. Cloth becomes a banner, and a shared idea becomes something that can outlast its first speaker. Fact 37. Albrecht Dürer connected Germany and Italy. Albrecht Dürer was a German artist whose travels and prints helped connect Northern and Italian Renaissance traditions. He studied proportion, perspective, nature, and the human body, while also producing engravings and woodcuts that circulated widely. A print could carry an image far beyond the workshop where it was made. Dürer understood this new reach. His monogram became a recognizable mark, almost like an early form of artistic branding. His work, Adverts, shows the Renaissance artist becoming more visibly individual, learned, and internationally connected. But Dürer was also a craftsman of extraordinary discipline. An engraving requires patience, precise lines, and the ability to imagine how a carved or incised surface will appear once it is inked and pressed onto paper. The centuries do not need to feel distant tonight. A hand turning a page, a maker checking a line, or a family gathering around a table are scenes that remain understandable across time. Fact 38. Printing changed the speed of communication. Around the middle of the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg developed the system that produced the Gutenberg Bible, the first great book printed in Western Europe with movable metal type. Printing did not create reading, writing, or books, and movable type had earlier histories in East Asia. But in Europe, the new press transformed the scale and speed at which texts could be reproduced. Books that once required longhand copying could be made in multiple copies. Printers, editors, type cutters, paper makers, sellers, illustrators, and readers formed a new world of communication. Printing helped Renaissance ideas travel, but it also carried religious arguments, practical manuals, jokes, maps, legal texts, songs, and news. Let the noise of the day grow quieter as we continue. The history of the Renaissance is not only about display, it is also about waiting, observing, revising, and beginning again. Fact 39. Venice became a great printing city. By the late 15th century, Venice had become one of Europe's leading centers for printing and publishing. Its position as a trading city, its populations and its connections across the Mediterranean made it well suited to the book trade. Printers in Venice produced religious works, classical texts, scientific books, music, law, literature, and many other kinds of writing. The city attracted scholars, editors, translators, artisans, and booksellers. A printed page may look quiet, but it depended on a whole chain of labor. Paper mills, metal workers, ink makers, proofreaders, binders, shippers, and merchants. Venice's presses turned ideas into portable objects that could travel along the same routes as silk, glass, grains, and letters. In the background of every grand story are ordinary sounds. Water being poured, tools being set down, paper rustling, footsteps crossing a room, and a door closing against the night. Fact 40. Aldus Manutius made books smaller and more portable. The Venetian printer Aldus Manutius is remembered for publishing editions of Greek and Latin authors, and for helping popularize smaller, more portable books. His press worked with scholars to prepare texts for readers who wanted learning in a convenient form. Small books could be carried more easily, read while traveling, or kept in a private room. Aldine editions also influenced typography, including the use of italic type. The importance of this is easy to overlook. A change in book size can change habits of reading. Knowledge becomes less tied to a lectern, a library desk, or a large communal volume. It can move into a bag, a pocket, a journey, or a quiet moment by a window. The further we go, the more the Renaissance becomes a living landscape rather than a list of dates. It contains people with hopes, limits, rivalries, routines, and brief moments of wonder. Fact 41. Prints spread images as well as words. Woodcuts, engravings, and later etchings allowed images to circulate in multiple impressions. A design cut into wood or incised into metal could be inked and pressed onto sheets of paper again and again. Prints could reproduce religious scenes, maps, portraits, ornaments, costumes, famous artworks, battle scenes, and strange creatures. They became a new visual language across Europe. An artist in one city could influence someone far away who had never seen the original work. Printmaking also changed how people collected images. A wealthy person might own paintings, but a much wider range of buyers could purchase smaller printed sheets. The image was becoming more mobile, more repeatable, and more capable of crossing borders. Let that small part of the story settle for a moment. The Renaissance was built from layers, not sudden flashes. One workshop, one letter, one copied page, one conversation, and one careful decision at a time. Fact 42. Education often began with language. Humanist education placed strong emphasis on language because language was seen as a tool for thought and public action. Students learned grammar, read classical authors, practiced rhetoric, translated passages, wrote letters, and memorized examples from history and poetry. The ideal was not merely to sound elegant. A person who could speak and write well might serve a city, advise a ruler, teach, negotiate, or defend an argument. In practice, access to education was unequal. Wealth, gender, family position, religion, and location all mattered. Still, the Renaissance made learning itself a visible form of ambition. A library, a book, or a learned conversation became symbols of identity, not just private possessions. There is no need to hold every detail in your mind. You can simply picture a lamplit room, a sheet of paper, and someone pausing over a problem that another generation may one day call important. Fact 43. Rhetoric mattered in politics and daily life. Rhetoric is the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Renaissance humanists studied ancient speeches and canals. They believed words could shape public life. A well-made argument might persuade a council, comfort a friend, honor a patron, or criticize an enemy. Letters became important social instruments. They could carry news, advice, praise, requests, and carefully measured emotion. The ideal of eloquence gave language a kind of architecture. A speech needed structure, rhythm, examples, and a sense of audience. Even when Renaissance politics were narrow or unequal, people understood that words could move power. The right phrase, delivered at the right moment, might travel farther than a person could walk. For now, let the scene become quiet. Beyond the famous names were ordinary streets, shutters closing at dusk, footsteps on stone, and the patient work that allowed larger dreams to take shape. Fact 44. Libraries became places of prestige and memory. Renaissance libraries were more than rooms filled with books. They were statements about learning, family ambition, religious devotion, and cultural memory. A ruler or wealthy patron might commission shelves, desks, painted ceilings, and carefully selected manuscripts. Libraries could hold Greek and Latin classics, legal texts, theology, medicine, poetry, maps, and works in local languages. A collection displayed not only what someone owned, but what they wished to be associated with. Some libraries were private, while others were linked to monasteries, universities, or civic institutions. In each case, books gathered voices from different centuries into a single place. The silence of a library could contain arguments, jokes, prayers, and discoveries waiting for another reader. The past can feel far away until we notice its familiar rhythms. Learning a skill, waiting for a reply, saving for a purchase, making something carefully, and hoping it will last. Fact 45. Renaissance courts collected art and ancient objects. Courts across Italy and Europe used collections to display refinement. A ruler or noble might gather antique statues, coins, cameos, Manuscripts, paintings, musical instruments, rare animals, natural curiosities, and finely made objects. These collections were often shown in private rooms called studioli or cabinets. They were spaces for study, conversation, and controlled wonder. An ancient coin might connect its owner to Rome. A strange shell or mineral might suggest the variety of nature. A painting might signal literary knowledge. Collections were not neutral. They reflected wealth, access, colonial and trading networks, and the power to acquire objects. But they also reveal a Renaissance appetite for arranging the world into meaningful, beautiful, and memorable forms. Picture the evening arriving over tiled roofs. Bells soften in the distance. Workshop doors close. And the day's unfinished questions remain on a table for tomorrow's hands to answer. Fact 46. Isabella d'Este was an influential patron. Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, was one of the best-known women patrons of the Italian Renaissance. Highly educated and deeply interested in music, poetry, antiquity, and art, she corresponded with artists and advisors, commissioned works, and shaped a celebrated collection. Her example is important because Renaissance culture was not created only by famous male artists and scholars. Women could act as patrons, readers, writers, collectors, rulers, musicians, and managers of households and courts, even though legal and social limits were real. Isabella's surviving letters show how much thought could go into taste, what should be acquired, where it should be placed, what it should mean, and how it should represent the person who owned it. A great age is never made only by its most famous people. It also depends on quiet concentration. A pigment ground smooth, a page corrected, a measurement checked, or a parcel carried safely home. Fact 47. Women's lives in the Renaissance were diverse and constrained. There was no single Renaissance experience for women. A noblewoman at a court, a merchant's daughter in a city, a nun in a convent, a market seller, a textile worker, and an enslaved woman lived under very different conditions. Marriage, dowries, inheritance, household labor, childbirth, religion, and rehabilitation shaped many lives. Some women received education or gained access to artistic and literary circles, while many others did not. Convents could provide certain women with opportunities for learning, music, administration, or artistic work that were difficult to find elsewhere. Remembering this variety keeps the Renaissance from becoming a parade of famous men. It was a world sustained by countless women whose labor, skills, and decisions often remain less visible in surviving records. As the story moves on, allow the details to drift like warm light across a wall. Some will remain clear. Others can fade gently, leaving only the calm feeling of a world slowly changing. Fact 48. Textiles were major Renaissance achievements. Renaissance luxury was not limited to paintings and marble. Textiles could be among the most valuable and impressive objects in a home, church, or court. Silk, velvet, wool, linen, embroidery, gold thread, and dyed fabrics carried enormous economic and social importance. Cities such as Florence and Venice were deeply connected to textile production and trade. Cloth signaled rank, wealth, ceremony, mourning, marriage, and political identity. A richly patterned textile required many hands: growers, spinners, dyers, weavers, merchants, tailors, and embroiderers. It could be worn, hung on a wall, spread across an altar, or presented as a gift. The Renaissance was tactile. Its colors and patterns were not only painted, they were woven into daily life. It is enough to notice the patience inside the achievement. WAD. Behind every finished object was a long sequence of small movements, repeated until a difficult task became familiar to hand. Fact 49. 1. Dyes carried knowledge across trade routes. The rich blues, reds, blacks, greens, and golds of Renaissance clothing and art depended on complicated materials and trade routes. Some dyes came from local plants, while others arrived through long-distance commerce. Cussa could be expensive because it required rare substances, skilled preparation, and repeated labor. Deep black clothing, for example, could demand careful dyeing and become a mark of status in some settings. Pigments for painting also had stories. Ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, was prized and costly. Its journeys from mines in Central Asia to European workshops reminds us that a Renaissance painting could contain materials gathered from far beyond the city where it was made. Beauty was often global before the modern word for globalization existed. The Renaissance can seem crowded with remarkable events, yet daily life still moved at a human pace. Meals, errands, weather, prayer, repairs, letters, and the quiet return of night. Fact 50. Food connected Renaissance cities to broad worlds. Renaissance meals varied greatly according to wealth, region, season, and religion. Most people did not eat the elaborate feasts shown in some paintings. Bread, beans, grains, vegetables, cheese, olive oil, wine, and local produce formed much of everyday life in many places. Wealthier households could serve more meat, spices, sugar, and imported goods. Trade made some ingredients symbols of distance and prestige. Sugar, pepper, citrus, and spices carried stories of ships, markets, and labor across continents. Food also followed rules of fasting, feast days, and household custom. To imagine the Renaissance kitchen is to imagine not only flavor, but storage jars, firewood, market stalls, gardens, seasonal rhythms, and the labor of people whose names rarely appear in art history. Let your thoughts travel slowly through the scene. Nothing here needs to be hurried. Each fact is only another doorway into a world that was complex, beautiful, difficult, and deeply human. Fact 51. Music filled courts, churches, and streets. Renaissance music was heard in many settings: churches, court celebrations, processions, homes, taverns, theaters, and public squares. Composers developed intricate polyphony in which several independent melodic lines move together. Sacred music could lift voices through vaulted spaces, while secular songs might be performed around a table or in a private chamber. Yaninari. Instruments such as lutes, viols, recorders, organs, shawms and drums offered different colors of sound. Music was social. It marked weddings, religious rituals, diplomacy, mourning, dance, and leisure. The written musical score became increasingly important, especially as printing helped music travel. Yet much musical life remained oral, learned by listening and repetition. A Renaissance city would have sounded far more alive than a silent gallery. There is a peaceful lesson in this. Knowledge often grows through attention rather than noise, through people noticing a detail that others had passed without seeing. Fact 52. Renaissance cities loved festivals and processions. Public festivals filled Renaissance streets with music, banners, costumes, religious images, theatrical scenes, horses, flowers, feet, and carefully ordered groups. A procession could celebrate its day, a political victory, a marriage, a visiting ruler, or a religious feast. These events turned the city into a stage. Guilds displayed their wealth. Families showed their rank. Artists designed temporary structures, painted banners, and devised dramatic effects. Much of this spectacle has vanished because it was made from cloth, wood, paper, wax, and human memory. But for people who lived through it, a festival could be as powerful as a permanent monument. It created a shared picture of who belonged, who ruled, what was sacred, and what the city wished the world to see. Imagine a window open to the evening air. Somewhere below, a cart rolls over stone, a dog barks once, a candle is lit, and another person begins the careful work of reading or making. Fact 53. Theatre grew from religious and civic traditions. Renaissance theatre developed through a mixture of religious drama, classical models, court entertainment, street performance, and local humor. Writers rediscovered ancient plays by authors such as Plautus and Terence, then adapted comic structures for their own audiences. Stages used painted scenery, perspective, music, machinery, and costume to create new worlds. In Italian courts, elaborate spectacles could honor a wedding or a ruler. In other places, traveling performers and local companies brought stories to broader audiences. Theatre was not only escape. It could comment on money, marriage, foolishness, ambition, authority, and ordinary conflict. The Renaissance stage made a useful promise. Even a small platform, if arranged with enough skill, could contain a city, a palace, a battlefield, or an entire imagined world. The important thing is not to memorize every name. It is to feel the long current beneath them. People sharing skills, preserving ideas, and trying to make sense of the world around them. Fact 54. Anatomy interested artists as well as physicians. Renaissance artists wanted to understand how the body looked beneath the skin. Muscles, bones, joints, tendons, and proportions mattered when painting or sculpting figures that seemed capable of movement. Opportunities for anatomical study were limited and varied by place and time. But some artists examined bodies through dissection or through collaboration with medical scholars. Leonardo produced detailed anatomical drawings, especially in the early 16th century. His studies show how art and science could overlap in a shared act of looking. The body became both a subject of beauty and an object of investigation. A hand in a painting might be graceful, but it also depended on tendons, joints, pressure, and balance. Let the picture remain soft around the edges. The Renaissance was full of sharp ambitions, but it was also filled with calm moments of study, craft, music, conversation, and observation. See Fact 55. The plague remained part of Renaissance life. The Renaissance unfolded in a Europe where plague returned repeatedly after the Black Death of the 14th century. Renaissance cities knew that disease could empty streets, interrupt trade, divide families, and alter daily routines with terrible speed. Public health measures varied, but some cities developed quarantine, inspection, burial, regulation, and isolation. Fear of illness affected art, religion, labor, inheritance, and memory. It is important not to turn plague into a simple explanation for the Renaissance. Cultural change had many causes. Yet the presence of mortality gave time a different weight. A commission, a book, a will, a chapel, or a portrait could feel urgent, because life itself was visibly uncertain. Now the scene can rest for a breath. A city, like a painting, is made from many layers, some bright and visible, others almost hidden beneath the surface. Fact 56. Maps were becoming more detailed and more widely shared. Renaissance mapmaking combined old traditions with new information from travel, trade, measurement, and printing. Maps were never neutral mirrors of the earth. They showed what makers and patrons considered important: ports, kingdoms, routes, rulers, rivers, mountains, sacred places, and claims to power. Some maps were practical tools for navigation or administration. Others were beautiful objects designed for libraries and courts. As geographic knowledge expanded, Europeans revised their ideas about the size and shape of the world, though many errors continued. A map gave viewers the strange experience of seeing distant lands from above. It turned unfamiliar places into lines, colors, names, and symbols. In doing so, it could inspire curiosity, commerce, conquest, or all three at once. Think of how slowly materials become meaningful. Stone becomes a statue. Ink becomes a book. Cloth becomes a banner. And a shared idea becomes something that can outlast its first speaker. Fact 57. Global voyages brought knowledge and violence together. The Renaissance era included European voyages across the Atlantic, around Africa, and into the Indian Ocean and the Americas. These journeys changed maps, diets, economies, and scientific knowledge. But they also brought conquest, enslavement, dispossession, and catastrophic disease to indigenous peoples. It is not enough to describe them simply as adventures of discovery. Lands were already inhabited, governed, named, and understood by the people who lived there. Renaissance Europe expanded its horizons, but often through violence and unequal power. This is one of the most important, quiet truths of the period. Curiosity can be generous, but it can also become a tool of control. A truthful history has room for wonder and for grief at the same time. The centuries do not need to feel distant tonight. A hand turning a page, a maker checking a line, or a family gathering around a table are scenes that remain understandable across time. Fact 58. The Columbian Exchange reshaped food and landscapes. After sustained contact between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, plants, animals, diseases, and people moved across oceans on an unprecedented scale. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, cacao, tobacco, and many other American crops eventually changed diets far beyond their original homes. Wheat, horses, cattle, sugarcane, and other Old World species transformed landscapes in the Americas. Diseases such as smallpox devastated many indigenous communities. These changes unfolded over generations and cannot be summarized as a simple exchange between two equals. Quinart. They were tied to colonization, forced labor, migration, and ecological upheaval. Still, they show how quickly daily life can change. When a seed, animal, or illness crosses a sea and finds a new place to grow. Let the noise of the day grow quieter as we continue. The history of the Renaissance is about display. It is also about waiting, observing, wide, revising, and beginning again. Fact 59. The Renaissance was connected to the Ottoman world. Renaissance Italy and the Ottoman Empire were not isolated enemies separated by a wall. They traded, negotiated, fought, exchanged gifts, hired specialists, and watched one another closely across the Mediterranean. Venice in particular maintained extensive commercial and diplomatic relations with Ottoman territories. Objects, textiles, pigments, manuscripts, technologies, and artistic motifs moved through these contacts. The relationship could be tense and violent, but it was also practical and deeply connected. This matters because the Renaissance is sometimes told as a purely European story. In reality, Mediterranean life depended on many cultures meeting, competing, borrowing, and translating. The sea did not only divide worlds, it also carried them toward one another. In the background of every grand story are ordinary sounds. Water being poured, tools being set down, paper rustling, footsteps crossing a room, and a door closing against the night. Fact 60. Islamic scholarship was part of the larger intellectual background. European Renaissance learning developed within a much broader history of scholarship that included Arabic, Persian, Jewish, Greek, Latin, and other intellectual traditions. Works of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and optics had been translated, commented on, and expanded in the Islamic world long before many were read in Renaissance Europe. Scholars in Iberia, Sicily, Italy, and elsewhere participated in complicated translation networks. This does not mean every Renaissance idea came from one direction. It means knowledge has many ancestors. A book can pass through several languages, acquire new notes, and reach readers who no longer know all the hands that preserved it. The Renaissance inherited a crowded library, not an empty room. The further we go, the more the Renaissance becomes a living landscape rather than a list of dates. It contains people with hopes, limits, rivalries, routines, and brief moments of wonder. Fact 61. Astronomy was both practical and philosophical. Renaissance people looked to the sky for calendars, navigation, religious meaning, weather patterns, and philosophical questions. Astronomy and astrology were often closely linked in ways that feel unfamiliar today. Learned people could calculate planetary motions while also believing the heavens influenced events on Earth. Universities taught inherited models of the cosmos, especially the idea of an Earth-centered universe. Yet observation, mathematics, new instruments, and new debates slowly put pressure on old certainties. The night sky remained the same visible dome it had always been, but its meaning was becoming more contested. For people without electric lights, the stars were not distant decoration. They were part of the practical and imaginative structure of the world. Let that small part of the story settle for a moment. The Renaissance was built from layers, not sudden flashes. One workshop, one letter, one copied page, one conversation, and one careful decision at a time. Fact 62. Copernicus proposed a sun-centered model. Copernicus proposed that the Earth and other planets move around the sun. His model did not immediately overturn older astronomy, and it still used complex calculations to explain observed motion. But it offered a different way to arrange the cosmos. The idea was startling because it asked people to imagine the Earth as moving, even though it felt still beneath their feet. Copernicus published his major work in 1543, near the end of his life. Its influence grew gradually through debate, calculation, observation, and later controversy. The Copernican model is a reminder that a revolutionary idea can begin quietly in a book, waiting for readers willing to test what it makes possible. There is no need to hold every detail in your mind. You can simply picture a lamplit room, a sheet of paper, and someone pausing over a problem that another generation may one day call important. Fact 63. Nature studies brought art and inquiry together. Renaissance artists often studied plants, animals, rocks, clouds, water, and lay new intensity. A painted flower might be recognizable as a particular species. A bird might have a believable weight on a branch. A distant mountain might fade with atmospheric perspective. This did not mean artists became modern scientists in every sense. Symbolism, tradition, and imagination remained important, but observation gained prestige. Looking carefully at the world could be seen as a route to knowledge, beauty, and even religious wonder. The natural world was not merely a background for human drama. It became a subject worthy of patient attention in its own right. For now, let the scene become quiet. Beyond the famous names were ordinary streets, shutters closing at dusk, footsteps on stone, and the patient work that allowed larger dreams to take shape. Fact 64. Gardens were designed places of order and retreat. Renaissance gardens combined plants, water, sculpture, terraces, paths, shade, fragrance, and views. They could be practical spaces for herbs and fruit, but elite gardens also became places for display, conversation, and contemplation. Geometry organized beds and walkways. Fountains made sound. Statues referred to ancient stories. A garden could feel like a small ideal world where nature had been guided into balance by human design. Yet, real gardens depended on soil, climate, labor, irrigation, pruning, and seasonal change. Their order was never permanent. Leaves fell. Water pipes needed repair. Plants grew too quickly or not at all. That mixture of plan and unpredictability made gardens a fitting Renaissance image. Reason, working gently with nature, never fully mastering it. The past can feel far away until we notice its familiar rhythms. Learning a skill, waiting for a reply, saving for a purchase, making something carefully, and hoping it will last. Fact 65. Engineering served both spectacle and survival. Renaissance engineers designed bridges, canals, fortifications, pumps, cranes, mills, stage machines, and devices for lifting or moving heavy materials. Some inventions were practical, while others were drawn as imaginative possibilities. Cities needed water, transport, defense, and construction. Courts wanted theatrical surprises. Armies wanted stronger walls and more effective weapons. Engineering, therefore, sat between daily necessity and dramatic display. A machine could save labor, demonstrate power, or simply amaze an audience at a festival. Leonardo's famous sketches belong to this wider culture of design. They remind us that Renaissance curiosity was often mechanical. People wanted to know not only what the world looked like, but how it moved, flowed, balanced, and could be built. So, picture the evening arriving over tiled roofs. Bells soften in the distance. Workshop doors close, and the day's unfinished questions remain on a table for tomorrow's hands to answer. Fact 66. City planning expressed ideals of order. Renaissance thinkers often imagined ideal cities with straight streets, balanced squares, harmonious buildings, and clear civic spaces. Actual cities remained messy. They had narrow lanes, old churches, crowded markets, drainage problems, noise, animals, and neighborhoods built over centuries. Still, the dream of orderly urban design mattered. A plaza could be reshaped. A palace facade could give a street a new rhythm. A public building could frame civic ceremony. Perspective paintings of ideal towns made order appear almost effortless, with buildings receding toward a central point. They offered a visual hope that social life itself might become balanced and rational. Reality was more complicated, but the dream helped guide architecture and political imagination. A great age is never made only by its most famous people. It also depends on quiet concentration. A pigment ground smooth, a page corrected, a measurement checked, or a parcel carried safely home. Fact 67. Rome became a major Renaissance center. Rome had ancient ruins everywhere. Arches, columns, statues, inscriptions, roads, baths, and broken fragments of a former empire. During the Renaissance, Popes and wealthy church officials commissioned new buildings, chapels, paintings, and sculptures that transformed the city. Rome became a place where Christian authority and classical antiquity stood close together, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension. Artists traveled there to study ancient forms and seek major commissions. The city offered both inspiration and pressure. To build or paint in Rome was to work beneath the shadow of many pasts: imperial, Christian, political, and artistic. Its ruins were not only evidence of what had been lost, they were invitations to build again. As the story moves on, allow the details to drift like warm light across a wall. Some will remain clear. Others can fade gently, leaving only the calm feeling of a world slowly changing. Fact 68. Papal patronage shaped art in Rome. Popes and senior church officials became major patrons during the Renaissance. They commissioned churches, chapels, libraries, tombs, frescoes, statues, and urban projects. Such patronage could arise from devotion, institutional ambition, family memory, competition, and the desire to make Rome visually worthy of its spiritual claims. The results include some of the most famous works in Western art. Yet, papal patronage was also tied to politics and money, and critics sometimes objected to extravagance. The Renaissance Church was not a single simple institution. It contained reformers, diplomats, scholars, artists, administrators, monks, and powerful families. Art became one way to make spiritual and political authority visible in stone, paint, and ceremony. It is enough to notice the patience inside the achievement. Behind every finished object was a long sequence of small movements, repeated until a difficult task became familiar to the hands. Fact 69. St. Peter's Basilica took generations to build. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome began in the early 16th century and involved several major architects, including Bramante, Michelangelo, and others. The project was vast, expensive, and slow. It changed plans over time, reflected changing papal priorities, and became entangled with debates about church finance. Buildings of this scale are never the work of one mind alone. They grow through generations of decisions, arguments, calculations, and labor. St. Peter's also shows how Renaissance architecture could aim for a sense of universal grandeur. What? A visitor entering such a space was meant to feel scale in the body. The height above, the distance ahead, the sound of footsteps, and the smallness of an individual beneath a dome. The Renaissance can seem crowded with remarkable events, yet daily life still moved at a human pace. Meals, errands, weather, prayer, repairs, letters, and the quiet return of night. Fact 70. The Reformation changed the Renaissance world. In the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation challenged the authority, practices, and teachings of the Catholic Church. Printing helped arguments travel quickly, while rulers, cities, scholars, and ordinary believers took different sides. The result was not only theological debate. It was also political conflict, migration, censorship, destruction of images, in some places, and the reshaping of education and worship. Renaissance humanism contributed to some reform movements by encouraging close reading of ancient and biblical texts, but it did not lead automatically to any one outcome. The Reformation reminds us that ideas do not remain calm once they enter public life. A printed page can become a debate, a movement, a law, or a war. Let your thoughts travel slowly through the scene. Nothing here needs to be hurried. Each fact is only another doorway into a world that was complex, beautiful, difficult, and deeply human. Fact 71. Religious art changed, but did not disappear. During the Reformation, some communities removed or destroyed religious images, while others continued to commission and cherish them. Catholic regions responded in their own ways, emphasizing clarity, devotion, teaching, and emotional impact in art. The result was not a sudden end to Renaissance creativity. Rather, religious conflict redirected artistic energy. Painters and sculptors had to consider what viewers believed images should do. Could a painting inspire prayer? Could it become an object of improper devotion? Could it teach people who could not read? These questions shaped churches and homes across Europe. Art remained powerful because people understood that images could move the heart as well as the eye. There is a peaceful lesson in this. Knowledge often grows through attention rather than noise, through people noticing a detail that others had passed without seeing. Fact 72. The sack of Rome in 1527 shocked Europe. In 1527, troops connected to the army of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sacked Rome. The event brought violence, looting, fear, and disruption to a city that had become a major center of Renaissance art and patronage. Artists, scholars, and residents fled or adapted to sudden instability. The sack is sometimes used as a symbolic ending for the High Renaissance. Although historical periods rarely end so neatly, its real importance lies in the reminder that cultural brilliance can exist beside political fragility. A city may be full of libraries, paintings, churches, and ambitious plans, yet still be vulnerable to armies and hunger. History does not protect beauty merely because beauty has been made. Imagine a window open to the evening air. Somewhere below, a cart rolls over stone, a dog barks once, a candle is lit, and another person begins the careful work of reading or making. Fact 73. Mannerism made harmony more complicated. After the balanced compositions, often associated with the High Renaissance, some 16th century artists developed styles later called mannerism. Figures became elongated, poses more artificial, spaces more uncertain, colors more surprising, and compositions more restless. This was not simply a decline from earlier perfection. It was a different response to a changing world. Artists such as Pontormo, Bronzino, Parmigianino, and others explored elegance, tension, refinement, and ambiguity. Mannerist art can feel strange because it refuses easy balance. A body may stretch beyond ordinary proportion. A room may tilt. A gesture may be graceful but unreadable. It is the Renaissance discovering that beauty can also be unsettling. The important thing is not to memorize every name. It is to feel the long current beneath them. People sharing skills, preserving ideas, and trying to make sense of the world around them. Fact 74. The artist's reputation rose during the Renaissance. In medieval Europe, many artists were respected craftsmen. But Renaissance culture increasingly celebrated certain makers as exceptional individuals. Biographies, letters, signatures, portraits, and stories helped create artistic reputations. Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, published in the 16th century, became especially influential in shaping the idea of artistic genius. It told dramatic stories of talent, rivalry, struggle, and achievement. Such stories can be entertaining, but they sometimes simplify the shared and practical nature of artistic work. Still, the change was real. Artists could be admired not only for finishing a commission, but for having a distinctive style, a learned mind, and a personal vision. And the name of the maker began to matter more visibly alongside the work. Let the picture remain soft around the edges. The Renaissance was full of sharp ambitions, but it was also filled with calm moments of study, craft, music, conversation, and observation. Fact 75. Vasari helped invent the story of the Renaissance. Giorgio Vasari was a painter, architect, and writer whose biographies of artists strongly influenced how later generations imagined the Renaissance. He arranged art history as a story of progress, with earlier artists preparing the way for masters such as Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. This narrative was powerful, but it also had limits. It favored certain regions, artists, and values, especially those connected to Florence and central Italy. Modern historians use Vasari with care, appreciating his vivid observations while questioning his biases. His book teaches an important lesson about history itself. The past does not arrive already organized. Someone always chooses where to begin, whom to praise, and what counts as improvement. Now the scene can rest for a breath. A city, like a painting, is made from many layers, some bright and visible, others almost hidden beneath the surface. Fact 76. Artists depended on materials from many places. A Renaissance masterpiece might appear to belong entirely to one city, yet its materials could come from a wide network. Wood panels, canvas fibers, pigments, gold leaf, marble, metal, paper, and dyes all had their own routes. Marble might come from quarries far from a workshop. Lapis lazuli for ultramarine came from Central Asia. Gold moved through trade and finance. Paper depended on water, mills, rags, and labor. Even a local church commission was connected to wider worlds of extraction, transport, and exchange. This material history adds depth to art. A blue cloak is not only a beautiful color, it is also the result of geology, trade, expense, and the choices of a patron who agreed to pay for it. Think of how slowly materials become meaningful. Stone becomes a statue, ink becomes a book, cloth becomes a banner, and a shared idea becomes something that can outlast its first speaker. Fact 77. Marble had to be quarried, shipped, and carved. Marble sculpture begins long before an artist touches a chisel. Stone had to be found, cut from a quarry, shaped for transport, moved along roads or waterways, and delivered without breaking. Each step involved danger and cost. A flaw inside the block could ruin months of work. The sculptor then had to imagine a figure within the stone, removing material slowly and permanently. Unlike paint, marble does not allow an easy return. The physical effort was enormous. Dust filled the air. Tools wore down. A strike could be too deep. Renaissance marble statues seem calm and effortless now, but they are monuments to planning, strength, patience, and the willingness to make irreversible decisions. The centuries do not need to feel distant. Tonight, a hand turning a page, a maker checking a line, or a family gathering around a table are scenes that remain understandable across time. Fact 78. Bronze casting was a technical art. Bronze sculpture involved its own difficult process. In the lost wax method, an artist could model a form in wax, cover it in a mold, melt the wax away, and pour molten metal into the empty space. The process required heat, fuel, timing, skilled assistance, and careful control. A failed casting could be costly and dangerous. Yet bronze offered qualities marble could not. Thin forms, complex gestures, durable surfaces, and rich changes of color over time. A bronze figure could catch light differently as the day passed. It could develop a patina through age and weather. Renaissance sculptors valued bronze for both its technical challenge and its visual life. Metal could seem surprisingly warm when shaped by a human hand. Let the noise of the day grow quieter as we continue. The history of the Renaissance is not only about display. It is also about waiting, observing, revising, and beginning again. Fact 79. Architecture relied on skilled labor at every level. The names of famous architects can make us forget the many people who built Renaissance structures. Masons cut stone. Carpenters raised scaffolding. Laborers carried loads. Plasterers smoothed walls. Metalworkers made fittings. Brickmakers, roofers, glaziers, painters, surveyors, and water carriers all contributed. A building was a social organism of work. Drawings and models mattered, but so did the knowledge held in bodies. How to balance a load, mix mortar, lift a beam, or judge whether a wall was true. Renaissance architecture celebrated proportion and design, yet it depended on countless practical decisions made on site. A dome may have one famous name attached to it, but thousands of hands helped it rise. In the background of every grand story are ordinary sounds. Water being poured, tools being set down, paper rustling, footsteps crossing a room, and a door closing against the night. Fact 80. Trade brought luxury objects into homes and churches. Renaissance merchants dealt in cloth, spices, metals, grain, glass, books, ceramics, dyes, and many other goods. Homes and churches displayed some of these objects as useful things and as signs of connection to the wider world. A polished glass, a painted ceramic dish, a carved ivory, or a patterned carpet. could carry stories of distant workshops and trade routes. Objects moved as gifts, purchases, diplomatic offerings, inheritance, and loot. Their meanings changed as they traveled. A carpet, made in one region, might appear beneath the feet of a Madonna in a European painting, becoming both a familiar visual detail and a sign of luxury. The Renaissance interior was often more international than it first appears. The further we go, the more the Renaissance becomes a living landscape rather than a list of dates. It contains people with hopes, limits, rivalries, routines, and brief moments of wonder. Fact 81. Ceramics carried art into daily routines. Painted ceramics, often called maiolica in Italy, brought color and imagery into everyday objects such as plates, bowls, jars, and pharmacy vessels. Some pieces showed coats of arms, mythological scenes, portraits, or elaborate patterns. Others were more practical, holding medicines, oils, spices, or food. Ceramics remind us that Renaissance art was not limited to large public masterpieces. Design entered kitchens, tables, shops, and storerooms. A person might handle an object that was both useful and beautiful several times a day. The painted surface could turn a simple bowl into a small story. It could record a family name, a wedding, a religious image, or a scene borrowed from ancient literature. Let that small part of the story settle for a moment. The Renaissance was built from layers, not sudden flashes. One workshop, one letter, copied page, one conversation, and one careful decision at a time. Fact 82. Glassmaking flourished in Venice. Venice became famous for glassmaking, especially on the island of Murano. Glassworkers developed techniques for clear glass, colored glass, decorative forms, mirrors, beads, and vessels that traveled widely. The craft required heat, timing, skill, and closely guarded knowledge. A glass object can seem delicate and effortless, but its creation involves intense fire and rapid shaping. Venetian glass became desirable across Europe because it combined utility, novelty, and luxury. In a Renaissance room, light passing through glass could produce a small private spectacle. A cup, mirror, or bead could catch the eye and transform a familiar space. Such objects show how craftsmanship made beauty part of everyday material life. There is no need to hold every detail in your mind. You can simply picture a lamplit room, a sheet of paper, and someone pausing over a problem that another generation may one day call important. Fact 83. Clothing was a public language. Renaissance clothing told people about rank, occupation, gender, age, wealth, mourning, and occasion. Fabrics, colors, sleeves, hats, shoes, jewelry, and fur could all communicate social meaning. Some cities passed sumptuary laws that tried to regulate what different groups were allowed to wear. Such laws were not always obeyed, but they show how seriously appearance was taken. Clothing was not merely private taste. It was visible social order. A portrait could carefully display a sleeve, chain, or brocade because viewers understood what those details meant. At the same time, fashions changed, and people found ways to imitate, adapt, or resist elite styles. A city's streets were moving galleries of fabric, color, ambition, and restraint. For now let the scene become quiet. Beyond the famous names were ordinary streets, shutters closing at dusk, footsteps on stone, and the patient work that allowed larger dreams to take shape. Fact 84. Marriage linked families, property, and ritual. For many Renaissance families, marriage was not only a personal relationship. It was also an alliance between households, tied to property, dowry arrangements, inheritance, reputation, and future children. Ceremonies could involve clothing, feasts, gifts, music, and public display. Art sometimes marked these moments through portraits, painted chests, textiles, or domestic objects. Romantic love certainly existed, and poets wrote about it endlessly. But marriage decisions were often shaped by broader family concerns. This can feel distant from modern expectations, yet it helps explain why household life was so central to Renaissance culture. The home was a place of affection and conflict, but also a small economic institution where status, labor, memory, and survival were closely intertwined. The past can feel far away until we notice its familiar rhythms. Learning a skill, waiting for a reply, saving for a purchase, making something carefully, and hoping it will last. Fact 85. Domestic interiors were fuller than paintings suggest. Renaissance interiors were not usually empty rooms with one perfect object placed in the center. They contained chests, stools, tables, bedding, textiles, cookware, storage jars, religious images, tools, papers, and personal belongings. Space was often shared by many people, including family members, servants, apprentices, guests, and workers. Rooms could change function throughout the day. A chamber might be used for sleeping, eating, receiving visitors, sewing, storing goods, or business. Paintings sometimes show idealized interiors, but surviving inventories reveal crowded, practical lives. The Renaissance household was filled with movement. Feet on wooden floors, doors opening, swarming, cloth being folded, children learning, letters arriving, and errands beginning before sunrise. Picture the evening arriving over tiled roofs. Bells soften in the distance, workshop doors close, and the day's unfinished questions remain on a table for tomorrow's hands to answer. Fact 86. Confraternities joined faith with community. Confraternities were voluntary religious associations that played important roles in Renaissance life. Members might gather for prayer, charity, funerals, processions, assistance to the poor, and the care of fellow members. Some commissioned chapels, altarpieces, banners, or musical works. They created bonds beyond immediate family and offered people a structured way to participate in civic and religious life. Confraternities could include merchants, artisans, or people connected by a particular devotion or occupation. Their existence reminds us that Renaissance culture was not only shaped from above by princes and popes. Many collective activities came from groups of ordinary urban residents organizing their resources, rituals, and responsibilities together. A great age is never made only by its most famous people. It also depends on quiet concentration. A pigment ground smooth, a page corrected, a measurement checked, or a parcel carried safely home. Fact 87. Public squares were stages of civic life. A Renaissance piazza, or market square, was a place of commerce, news, ceremony, punishment, argument, and meeting. People bought food, heard announcements, watched processions, met travelers, and observed the changing politics of their city. Public buildings often faced the square, making government visible. Statues, fountains, and towers added symbolic weight. A bell could call citizens to attention. A crowd could gather quickly. The square was therefore both practical and theatrical. It made civic life visible in the open air. Today, a quiet historic square can seem almost peaceful, but in the Renaissance it would have been full of voices, animals, carts, bells, dust smells, bargaining, laughter, and sudden news. As the story moves on, allow the details to drift like warm light across a wall. Some will remain clear. Others can fade gently, leaving only the calm feeling of a world slowly changing. Fact 88. Letters were the nervous system of the Renaissance. Letters carried the business and intimacy of Renaissance life. Merchants sent instructions to partners. Rulers received reports from ambassadors. Scholars debated texts. Artists negotiated commissions. Families shared news of births, deaths, illnesses, marriages, and money. A letter could travel by messenger, ship, caravan, or trusted traveler, taking days or weeks to reach its destination. Because communication was slow, writers often tried to include many kinds of information in one page. The paper itself could carry emotion, careful handwriting, hurried corrections, a wax seal, a familiar phrase. Surviving letters give historians a rare sense of voices in motion. They show the Renaissance not only as a world of monuments, but as a web of people waiting for replies. It is enough to notice the patience inside the achievement. Behind every finished object was a long sequence of small movements, repeated until a difficult task became familiar to the hands. Fact 89. Ambassadors observed everything they could. Renaissance states sent ambassadors to foreign courts to negotiate, gather information, and represent the interest of their rulers. Diplomacy became increasingly professional, especially among Italian city-states. Ambassadors wrote reports about armies, ceremonies, finances, personalities, rumors, and political alliances. Their letters could be detailed, cautious, and sometimes gossipy. They knew that a small change in mood at a court might have large consequences. Diplomatic life required language skills, patience, etiquette, and the ability to listen without revealing too much. In this sense, the Renaissance was not only a period of artists looking at nature, it was also a period of officials looking carefully at one another, trying to read power through dinners, clothing, gestures, and silence. The Renaissance can seem crowded with remarkable events, yet daily life still moved at a human pace. Meals, errands, weather, prayer, repairs, letters, and the quiet return of night. Fact 90. Mercenaries shaped Italian politics. Many Renaissance Italian states relied on professional soldiers known as condottieri and the companies they commanded. Warfare was expensive, and city-states often hired military leaders rather than maintaining large permanent armies. These commanders could be skilled, ambitious, and politically influential. Their loyalties depended on contracts, pay, opportunity, and survival. The system gave Italian politics a restless quality. Alliances changed. A commander who served one city might later work for another. Art and warfare sometimes crossed paths, as rulers commissioned equestrian statues, portraits, and monuments to celebrate military success. The Renaissance city was not only a place of workshops and libraries, it was also a place where people worried about walls, weapons, taxes, and the arrival of an army. Let your thoughts travel slowly through the scene. Nothing here needs to be hurried. Each fact is only another doorway into a world that was complex, beautiful, difficult, and deeply human. Fact 91. Renaissance warfare was not romantic. Armor, banners, horses, and heroic paintings can make Renaissance warfare appear elegant from a distance. Real conflict involved fear, injury, disease, hunger, siege, displaced families, and the destruction of fields and homes. New artillery changed the threat faced by cities. Mercenary armies could become dangerous when unpaid. Civilians often carried the burden of taxes and disruption. Even victories could be expensive. A balanced history should hold both images at once. The polished armor in a portrait and the muddy road outside a besieged town. The Renaissance produced extraordinary art, but it did not free people from violence. Beauty and brutality often existed in the same political landscape, and there is a peaceful lesson in this. Knowledge often grows through attention rather than noise, through people noticing a detail that others had passed without seeing. Fact 92. Slavery was present in Renaissance Mediterranean societies. Slavery did not disappear from the Mediterranean during the Renaissance. Enslaved people from the Black Sea region, the Balkans, Africa, and elsewhere were bought, sold, inherited, and forced into domestic, agricultural, maritime, and other labor in different parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. The scale and conditions varied, but the reality must be remembered. Titian. Later European colonial systems expanded and transformed racialized slavery on an immense scale, but Renaissance societies were already entangled with human trafficking and coercion. This fact complicates idealized images of rebirth and beauty. A palace, banquet, or household could depend on labor that was hidden from celebratory art. The Renaissance was never a golden age for everyone who lived within it. Imagine a window open to the evening air. Somewhere below, a cart rolls over stone, a dog barks once, a candle is lit, and another person begins the careful work of reading or making. Fact 93. Renaissance wealth depended on unequal labor. The splendor of Renaissance courts and cities rested on many kinds of labor: farming, weaving, dyeing, mining, shipbuilding, domestic work, hauling, cooking, copying, cleaning, and caring for children. Much of this labor was poorly paid, unrecorded, or controlled by social hierarchies. Wealthy patrons could commission art because others grew food, made cloth, transported goods, and maintained homes. Recognizing this does not erase artistic achievement. It makes its context more honest. A magnificent painting or palace is not only an expression of individual genius, it is also evidence of an economy, a society, and many workers whose contributions rarely received equal recognition. History becomes more humane when we notice the hands outside the frame. The important thing is not to memorize every name. It is to feel the long current beneath them. People sharing skills, preserving ideas, and trying to make sense of the world around them. Fact 94. The Renaissance had no single ending. Historians use different dates to mark the end of the Renaissance. Some point to the sack of Rome in 1527. Others emphasize the Reformation, the rise of mannerism, the spread of Baroque art, political changes, or the growing impact of global empires. In Northern Europe, Renaissance developments followed different timelines from those in Italy. This uncertainty is not a weakness. It reflects the truth that cultural periods overlap. A Renaissance idea can continue in a later century, while a medieval practice can remain active in a Renaissance city. Labels are useful maps, but they are not the territory. The real past was full of people who did not know they were living between one age and another. Let the picture remain soft around the edges. The Renaissance was full of sharp ambitions, but it was also filled with calm moments of study, craft, music, conversation, and observation. Fact 95. The Renaissance left a habit of looking closely. One of the Renaissance's deepest legacies is a habit of attention. Artists studied bodies, light, architecture, plants, and faces. Scholars compared manuscripts. Printers corrected pages. Engineers measured forces. Mapmakers revised coastlines. Musicians experimented with voices. None of these practices began from nothing, and none belonged only to one culture. But together they gave Renaissance life a distinctive confidence that close looking mattered. The world could be observed, described, drawn, measured, argued about, and made newly visible. This legacy remains familiar today. Whenever someone sketches an idea, checks a source, studies an object, or notices how light falls across a room. Now the scene can rest for a breath. A city, like a painting, is made from many layers, some bright and visible, others almost hidden beneath the surface. Fact 96. The Renaissance also left unfinished questions. The Renaissance is often celebrated for beauty, learning, and curiosity. It also leaves unfinished questions about power, inequality, faith, empire, ownership, gender, and the uses of knowledge. Who received education? Who paid for monuments? Whose land and labor made wealth possible? Which voices were printed, and which were lost? Who was represented in portraits, and who remained invisible? These questions do not cancel the period's achievements. They make them more meaningful by placing them in a fuller human story. The past is most useful when it does not ask us to admire blindly. It asks us to look longer, listen more carefully, and notice both the light on the surface and the shadows that made the light possible. Think of how slowly materials become meaningful. Stone becomes a statue, ink becomes a book, cloth becomes a banner, and a shared idea becomes something that can outlast its first speaker. In Fact 97. Renaissance objects continue to change meaning. A Renaissance painting, manuscript, statue, or building does not have exactly the same meaning today that it had when first made. It may now stand in a museum, a restored church, a library, or a public square far from its original setting. Some objects were moved through war, trade, colonization, sale, or inheritance. Others remain in the places for which they were created. Modern viewers bring new questions about conservation, ownership, access, and interpretation. This changing meaning is part of an object's life. Art does not remain frozen simply because it is old. Each generation looks again and finds something different. A technical detail, a forgotten maker, a political message, a material journey, or a private emotion. The centuries do not need to feel distant tonight. A hand turning a page, a maker checking a line, or a family gathering around a table are scenes that remain understandable across time. Fact 98. Restoration reveals both art and history. Renaissance artworks have survived through repairs, cleaning, rebuilding, repainting, neglect, accidents, and careful conservation. Restorers must make difficult decisions about what to remove, what to preserve, and how to protect fragile materials without inventing what is missing with art. A darkened varnish can change the mood of a painting. A damaged fresco can lose parts of its story. A cracked statue can need support. Restoration sometimes reveals bright colors or hidden details that surprise viewers accustomed to a muted image. It also reminds us that survival is never automatic. The works we admire have passed through many hands, climates, wars, moves, and moments of care. Their present appearance is part of a long history, not an untouched original state. Let the noise of the day grow quieter as we continue. The history of the Renaissance is not only about display, it is also about waiting, observing, revising, and beginning again. Fact 99. Museums invite slow looking, but objects once lived elsewhere. Museums make Renaissance objects available to people from many places, but they also, remove works from some original settings. An altarpiece in a gallery no longer receives candlelight, incense, prayers, or the sound of a church choir. A portrait on a wall no longer hangs in the family room or palace chamber, where it once shaped daily interactions. Viewing art in a museum has its own gifts: close access, comparison, labels, conservation, and quiet. Yet it is helpful to imagine the earlier life of an object. What room did it inhabit? Who looked at it first? What sounds surrounded it? The more we ask these questions, the more a museum object becomes a doorway, rather than a final destination. In the background of every grand story are ordinary sounds: water being poured, tools being set down, paper rustling, footsteps crossing a room, and a door closing against the night. Fact 100. The Renaissance is still a living conversation. The Renaissance continues to be taught, argued about, filmed, painted, restored, and reimagined. Its famous names remain familiar because their works are compelling, but new research keeps widening the story. Historians study women patrons, artisans, migrants, enslaved people, printers, translators, merchants, materials, and the global networks behind familiar images. This broader view does not make the Renaissance less interesting. It makes it more alive. Instead of a small stage occupied by a few brilliant men, we see a vast connected world of makers, readers, workers, travelers, and communities. The Renaissance becomes not a finished answer, but a field of questions that continues to open whenever someone looks closely enough. The further we go, the more the Renaissance becomes a living landscape rather than a list of dates. It contains people with hopes, limits, rivalries, routines, and brief moments of wonder. And so our quiet walk through the Renaissance comes to an end. We have moved through city streets and cathedral domes, through libraries and workshops, across pages of paper and layers of paint. We have seen that the Renaissance was not one simple rebirth, and not a single story told by a few famous names. It was a long human conversation, made from curiosity and craft, ambition and patience, beauty and contradiction. Somewhere in that world, a printer set type into a frame, an apprentice ground pigment, a scholar compared two old manuscripts, a musician tuned an instrument, a mason checked the angle of a wall, a family waited for a letter. These small actions, repeated across generations, helped shape the larger history we remember. Now there is no need to hold the details any longer. Let Florence, Venice, Rome, and all those distant rooms grow softer in your mind. Let the domes and paintings fade into the calm blue of night. Let the bells grow, choirs burn low, and the old pages close gently. Thank you for spending this time with history to fall asleep. Sleep well, and good night.